Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this Farm and Sea to Campus Forum on local food tracking systems, hosted by Farm to Institution New England, also called FINE for short. My name is Tanya Taranowski. I'm the Director of Programs for Farm to Institution New England, and I'll be moderating the webinar. I'm really glad you could all join us today for what I expect to be a great webinar. Farm to Institution New England is the backbone organization for a 6-state network of nonprofit, public, and private entities who are all working to mobilize the power of regional institutions to transform our food system. We work to increase the amount of good local food served in our region's schools, hospitals, colleges, and other institutions. For more information about FINE, please check out our website at farmtoinstitution.org. There's a wealth of resources there, and it'll be a good place to refer back to this webinar if you have any questions. We'll have a link there, as well as more information about tracking and tools and resources that will help you in your work. The New England Farm and Sea to Campus Network is a community of higher education and food system stakeholders. And working in coordination with FINE, they connect, share, and collaborate to develop transparent regional supply chains and educate campus communities about regional food systems. The forum is our webinar series that provides an opportunity for anyone to connect, share, and learn about farm-to-campus issues in New England. Everyone who's joined us today is welcome to get more involved with the Farm and Sea to Campus network. You can subscribe to our listserv. You can participate in a working group. We have several different ones with different focuses, and we're always interested in looking at new opportunities. You can also attend the Farm to Institution Summit. That's taking place in April of next year, and you can check out the website for more information about the summit as well. And you can join future webinars. As we get started, I'd just like to take a minute to introduce you to this webinar platform, Zoom. Most of you may be familiar with it, particularly if you've been on a FINE webinar before, but just as a quick reminder, we'll be using 2 interactive features today. On the slide right now, you can see examples of those 2. The first is the chat box. If you look down at the bottom of your screen, your Zoom screen, you'll see a black bar. If you don't see it immediately, just run your cursor over that edge of the screen and it should pop up. If you click on the chat button, that will enable you to speak with anyone who is on the webinar today. You can message everyone or you can message someone privately. And that just allows you to have a little dialogue while we're going through the presentations. There's another button called the Q&A button. That's also down in that same bar. And in that one, you can enter questions for the presenters. We'll tackle those in our Q&A session after all the presentations are complete. But you can enter your questions at any time as they occur to you. So, after this brief webinar introduction, we're going to have really 3 great guest speakers joining us in today's conversation on local food tracking. After the presentations, we'll have a short Q&A session, and then we'll conclude with some helpful resources on local food tracking, which will also be available after the webinar. Then at that point, you'll receive an advanced preview of FINE and Farm and Sea to Campus Network's new tracking report, along with all the helpful resources we've noted in the slides. So, without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce our 3 guest speakers today. First up is Michael Leviton. He'll lead things off by sharing information about FINE's soon-to-be-released report on local food tracking systems for campuses. Among several other roles, Michael's part of our Farm and Sea to Campus network, and he co-chairs the Evaluation and Tracking Working Group, which helped develop the tracking report. We're then going to hear from 2 speakers who are going to share their experiences in developing local food tracking systems. First, we'll have Jamie Moore of Eden Park Hospitality Group, and then Garrett DiStefano of the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. So with that, I'd like to hand things over to Michael. Michael, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much, everyone, for joining in. Just a couple of brief words of introduction. I was formerly the chef and owner of Lumiere, Area 4, and A4 Pizza in the Boston area. But sold my interest in all the restaurants a couple of years ago to try and create a more sustainable life for me and for my family. Since then, I've started Region FoodWorks, which is trying to create a secure value chain between farmers, processors, distributors and institutions in and around New England. The idea being regionally sourced and regionally processed value-added foods. I've been a long time advocate for sustainability, even from the time I started cooking in the late 80s when sustainability wasn't even part of the culinary lexicon. I've had the great fortune to work with people for whom this stuff was important. I sat on the board and was the board chair of the Chefs Collaborative for a long time. I still do a lot of work with Seafood Watch's Blue Ribbon Task Force and the Beard Foundation's Chefs Action Network, in addition to my work with FINE. In terms of this tracking report, the farm to institution sector is clearly a very important part of a growing local food movement and getting that movement to scale. FINE supports a network of organizations with a common interest in continuing the growth in the local sustainable movement. And a core part of that support is our metrics project, which collects and analyzes data, shares that information to help us understand where we've been, where we are currently, and how we might set new goals and achieve them. If you can't measure your progress very simply, you can't demonstrate that change for your stakeholders. In 2015, FINE launched the Campus Dining Survey to try and get a better understanding of how and why the schools and universities that our members were working on local food sourcing. And we'd very much like to make sure that all the people and institutions who are participating on this call and who responded to the most survey this summer. There are a whole host of ways you can use the information provided. You can read about it, about all of our 2015 findings online in our report, Campus Dining 101. There's a link somewhere. And stay tuned for more info on the 2018 survey. We'll be sharing these results during the New England Farm to Institution Summit this coming April. In 2015, one particular finding we noted was that although most responding institutions were already sourcing some measure of local food and expected to increase their local food purchases in the near future, nearly a third of respondents didn't have any sort of tracking system for their local purchases in place. And as such, they wouldn't know if they were in any way achieving their targets. So we decided to dig a little deeper into this to better understand if and how New England campuses are using some of the existing tracking systems, whether it be HE Stars, Real Food Challenge, or any of the proprietary systems used by a number of food service management organizations. And also to try and explore the effectiveness of each of those major systems. We interviewed individuals from 10 campuses representing 5 states. About half managed dining service operations, and then half were self-ops. While not necessarily a particularly comprehensive approach to the problem, these interviews provided a good in-depth starting point for us to better understand the tracking systems, their benefits, challenges, and potential areas for improvements. Are we on the next slide yet? Yes. This slide summarizes the 10 institutions we interviewed. You can see many are using more than one tracking system, and there's also a mix of proprietary and generally available systems being used across institutions. And then the next slide will cover a few of our key findings. first and foremost is the ability to establish some baseline data. And with that baseline, we can then begin to assess institutional progress towards particular local or sustainable purchasing goals. And one of the other great benefits there is simply the ability to market and promote all of the accomplishments to various stakeholders, be it administrators, funders, students, prospective students, and their families. Challenges. So there we go. Perhaps first among them is the how you might define what it is you want to measure. What is local? Obviously, there's a ton of definitions out there, and so it's defining them, among institutions, between institutions, for the food service management companies, by state, by miles. What's important is getting those definitions to be codified and well communicated. Also challenging or defining other sustainability indicators or externalities that are also being measured. So not just locality, but also degrees or measures of environmental sustainability, local community impacts, social factors, health and wellness impacts as well. All of these seem to be important to different segments of the institutions. And then, with processed items, we come into some questions about, is locally grown enough, or locally harvested, or locally processed, or trying to get at both. Often very difficult to define. Data management is another challenge, in that it's having to input and sort an awful lot of data requires a lot of time and effort, and a lot of the data, because it's coming from numerous different sources, can be complex in terms of putting it all together. And finally, communication. So numerous different audiences want different information, and trying to create a comprehensive report of all of the data can be significantly difficult. And then it's a matter of figuring out what's most important to communicate and to which audience. Recommendations of what we learned over our summer vacation. It's really important to find the right system or systems that meet your particular institution's needs. So customizing your own spreadsheets, which we saw a lot of, may give a certain degree of flexibility, but it's intensive to management, and it's not always easily shared. More automated or proprietary one-size-fits-all solutions certainly provide efficiencies, but they may not be particularly adaptable to each individual institution. There's a need to invest in staffing support. If there's not a sustainability manager in place, or a staff point person, someone like that is really important in terms of increasing efficiencies and improving data consistency and data management as well. It's also, we really need to begin to focus more on transparency and accountability through the supply chain by engaging our stakeholders, whether it's creating an advisory committee, setting clear goals, and getting purchasing commitments in contract, training staff to support your goals, engaging students, like with Real Food Challenge. Another recommendation is to collect data in universal formats, so zip code, town, county, to verify that it meets your particular or your institution's definition of local. And then also to try to collect information on certifications to help verify product attributes and to match them to programs such as Real Food or HE Stars. In summation, I hope that this quick summary has been into tracking systems has been of value. The research has certainly informed how we put together our 2018 campus dining survey, and we will very much continue our work to better understand how we can improve tracking efforts going forward. We encourage you to read through the full report for more details, and if you can't measure it, really it doesn't exist. So please keep that in mind. And with that, I'll hand things over to Jamie Moore of Eaton Park Hospitality Group.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, my name is Jamie, and I work for a restaurant and a food service management company out of the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. And we have 60 restaurants here in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. And we also operate food service establishments or contract food service throughout 13 states. So a little bit about what we've done is we focus on sourcing 20% of our foods from local sources. And it's part of our program that we started back in 2002 called Farm Source. And it was really a way that we put, a definition to what we were purchasing. And that is sort of where we started with developing our Farm Source program. You can go to the next slide. One of the things that we focus on in not only our Farm Source program, but we call it Know Your Source reporting. Know Your Source reporting is made up of 3 different pieces. Farm Source, which is our local commitment, and you can see the mile radiuses that we have established. We have verified are products that are coming with a third-party certification or verification. And then our last category are called Forge Partners. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a future slide. But one of the biggest things I wanted to really define here are the regions of how we associated these 250 miles and these 500 miles. So we divided our regions into the following 6 categories. And that is sort of what we end up doing when we develop our Know Your Source report. You can go ahead to the next slide. As I said, here's our Farm Source definition. This definition did change recently. It was at 150 miles. We moved it to 250 miles to be more in line with STAR's ASHI, as well as the Real Food Challenge, which both have adopted the 250 miles as well as the 500 miles for meat. So we recently changed that. We also changed our reporting cycle. Our reporting cycle used to be on a fiscal year, December or January through December, and now we have moved it to the end of May or May 31st through June 1st to be more in line with the school year. Next slide. So here's our 250-mile radius. This is essentially the geography that we're in. We're essentially in the Mid-Atlantic, and we venture over to Middle America to some extent. So that is sort of our way of looking at our 250-mile radius. And then we also have a 500-mile radius that looks like this. Obviously, it's getting a lot into Canada and a lot of other areas, but essentially these are the circles that we focus on. And each of the blue points that you see there are the centers of each of the regions that we're looking at. Next slide. So the verified foods, and this was an area that we did primarily because of the Real Food Challenge. We put this in place because a lot of our locations were requesting this information, and it really wasn't at our fingertips. So what we have done is we pull reports from a variety of different vendors that we work with. You know, I know that the Real Food Challenge, it's usually driven by students, or it's driven by students, where they're diving into some of the reports directly from what we're buying. And that obviously can be painstaking for a student or even an operator to really decipher, is this item an antibiotic-free product or is it certified organic? So what we have done is really pulled our suppliers in and asked them to provide us what items are third-party verified that you're selling to our locations. And what we do is we break down these reports by the supplier, by the location, and then ultimately the item number, which is derived from the supplier, and then the description of the product. And you can go to the next slide and I'll show you sort of a snapshot of what that, well, never mind, it's Forge Partners. So one of the other categories, as I said, there's three makeups of the things that we look to measure. One is our farm source, second is our verified product, and lastly is Forge Partners. Forge Partners are defined below, but really these are small manufacturers that we have found throughout our travels and throughout our opening up of new pieces of business in geographies that we have locations. So we come across a granola manufacturer or small producer in the Baltimore area, and we offer that small maker an opportunity to not only sell to our Baltimore locations, but throughout our whole entire geography where we may have locations. We do measure this primarily to show that we're somewhat forging and giving an opportunity to some of these makers to elevate what they have been able to sell within maybe their specific geography, but now they're able to expand their reach through a lot of our locations. And that's primarily the reason why we've established our Forge Partners. Next slide. So this is a little bit about what we're doing. So this is a snapshot of our access database. So all of the information that comes in from our suppliers, we then pull it into our access database and start to scrub the data. Scrubbing the data, basically, we ask our produce suppliers to send in essentially all of the items that are associated with being local to the definition that we have provided them, and then they provide us a report. The second slide, or the second picture that you have there, it says query local 2017 vendors by account New England. Those are essentially everything that we are paying through our accounting system by each of the locations that we service. So we basically have a report, we scrub the data and associate that item to be local by the region that they might be in. So the next slide will give you a little bit more detail. So here's essentially what it is. So if you can see, we have item number 177386. We know that is a Forge partner. So the Forge partner, Parma is a Forge partner in the Pittsburgh area. They are local to upstate New York and PA Central. This is a 500-mile supplier. So this supplier goes into 500 miles. And then they are also local to Ohio and Pennsylvania Western. And they're also local to Metro DC. So we take this data and we go through each of the line items of our usage reports. And U.S. Food Service, this is a U.S. Food Service report. This is made up of about 31,000 items. Next slide. And the finished report looks like this. So there is detail, as you can see down below. You see the different tabs. The first tab is the documentation. The next is the Know Your Source 2018 report, which you're seeing. And then you can dive in to see the broadline distributors, the direct distribution, the produce distributors, the specialty suppliers. And specialty suppliers are like your alcohol or your beer suppliers. There's also some C-store suppliers that fall under the specialty. And then verified purchases are the purchases that that are third-party verified. And then the last one is Forge Partners. As you can see, the percentages are all coming off of the total food and beverage purchases. So we're not looking at non-food when we're evaluating this. This is only breaking out the food and the food and beverage purchases. And then the second column are the broadline purchases, and then the direct distribution, and then miscellaneous. And that is essentially the Know Your Source report, but basically this is driven through an Access database with over 40 different suppliers are going into this specific database. And it is, I know that Michael mentioned having staff and having people being able to do this work for you. It would be lovely, but this is a labor of my love. This is something that takes about 60 to 70 hours to be able to put together. And that's what I've got for you. And I'm going to pass this off now to Garrett.
Thank you very much, Jamie and Michael. Excellent presentations. It's an honor to have the opportunity to talk to you all today. My name is Garrett DiStefano, and I am the Director of Residential Dining for the University of Massachusetts, and I have the opportunity to oversee the sustainability department as well within your organization. Structurally, it's what I consider a great opportunity in the sense that within the University of Massachusetts, and we've been committed to our local healthy and sustainable movement for well over a decade now, and having the structural ability to not only look at what we should be doing, but actually start to execute those particular things and driving that all into one organization makes us have the ability to really gain some momentum. We're building off the shoulders of some wonderful people who developed our sustainability program many years ago, starting back off with Brian Harb and Rachel Dutton, who were kind of the pioneers of what we did here, and building from there. When we had our own first permaculture garden that took us to the White House, and that way back in 2012, and now starting to look at how it becomes more of a regular occurrence, that what we do in terms of healthy, sustainable, local foods, and what the impact of that is going to be upon campus life, and how that actually basically adds to the health and wellness to our student base. Because when we start to look at that, and we start to do a lot of metrics, and as you start to look back at what Michael was talking about and Jamie were talking about in terms of the importance of that, it's really important not only to be able to say what you're doing, but start to make some inroads and starting to really develop what's going to target into the future. If you look at our, where we go, where we're going, what we want to do is it's really based upon our mission, which is to deliver the most healthy, sustainable food in the most environmentally conscious manner. And we really go back as being a mission-driven organization to saying that those are the key points that are really, I guess, guiding our way. If you want to take a look at the next slide, as we start to look at what we're doing and how we started to look at things, one of the biggest things, and I think Michael alluded to it as well, is what to measure rather. And so the idea of data management. When you have larger and smaller organizations that are out there, it's very difficult to say, well, just because you're a big organization or a small organization, it goes into the overall impact of how much you can purchase and what that purchase, or basically what you've been able to accomplish over a period of time, because sometimes that can be washed. UMass Dining happens to be one of the largest dining programs in the nation. We feed over 6 million meals a year. So of course we have a larger purchasing budget than some of the smaller mid-sized schools out there. But when you start to look at things on more of a per capita basis, it's starting to figure out how your regional purchases come into play. That really starts to break down what the success you have, either large or small. Per capita is one of those figures that we start to look at, so we can start to really drill it right down to the student basis. You know, when we talk to students, we find that students really find that it's really important. And I'm going to get to that in a little bit about, you know, why local food is important to them and how that actually helps them. But when we start to look at just overall impact, and you start to say, you know, what is it that we're doing that overall impacts the overall economy? You know, UMass Dining over the past, in FY17, did about $2.4 million in Massachusetts purchases alone. And very similar to how Jamie was talking about how kind of almost a tiered approach, so to speak, we're looking at that aspect as well. We start to look at, first of all, purchasing from Massachusetts, and then we start to look at New England as a whole, and then we start to look at, you know, that 250-mile radius. So we're very much in line with what the Real Food Challenge has to talk about, as well as other third-party measures and metrics as we start to look at things that the 50 by 60 plan and things of that nature, and trying to really develop a measure so that we can start to develop purchasing plans around what those targeted things are, and then starting to really make a larger impact upon it. You take a look at our next slide over here when we're going to take a look at what we've been doing and how we start to set some goals, as I was talking about before. You know, our goal has been to increase our overall local sustainable purchasing by over $600,000 a year. We've been able to do that. Meanwhile, at the same token, when you start to really figure out how that is going to impact not only your overall engagement, but what your bottom line needs to come into play. And a lot of that has to come into play with food and food waste management, things of that nature, tracking those particular things. So not only you're able to limit the amount of waste you have, but also you're going to be able to bring that into play in terms of being able to recoup those resources and bring them into as more purposeful in terms of being able to buy more local foods. When we start to talk to our students and we really engage them, now again, very similar to what Jamie was talking about when he came to his definitions, we define you know, our core purchasing being Massachusetts, but when we start to look at other vendors that we want to look at that, you know, we want to do business with that may be outside of the Massachusetts or New England range, we want to have them hit certain criteria. And that's why we look at different things like the Real Food to be able to say, okay, does this particular organization, you know, promote fair trade? Does this particular organization, you know, have practices that we're in line with? We had the opportunity to have one of our guest chefs, of which we do over 60 guest chefs a year here at the University of Massachusetts. And she said something very interesting. Her name was Virginia Willis. And the other day she was giving a presentation about some plant-based proteins and peanuts and things of that nature. And she basically said, you know, the cost of the food and who's going to pay for it. And what made it interesting is that, you know, you may have lower costing food, but somebody paid for that food somewhere down the line. Is it the fact that there are unfair labor practices that are used within the manufacturing or harvesting of that food? Were there antibiotics and all sorts of different growth hormones that were used within a particular you know, growing of, or was the animal treated inhumane? So as you start to look at how different, you know, different practices are used, not only locally, but globally, you start to develop how we come up with this local healthy and sustainable movement in terms of what, and as we start to move our food into that direction. As currently, we're looking at a little over 18.5, almost 19% of our total food is sourced locally, with over 30% of our produce being sourced locally. And we continue to grow in that area year over year. And again, we're always driven by our mission of producing the most healthy, sustainable food in the most environmentally conscious manner. On our next slide, you're going to see basically how important is it to having local ingredients. And we survey students, and we're very fortunate in that we have the opportunity to have a very engaged student base. We survey them 2 times a year through a very large survey of over 4,000 surveys that go out. We have about a 30 to 35% response rate. And then we also have the opportunity to look at students on more of a, I guess, a granular basis from time to time. We'll ask them one-off questions like the one you're seeing in front of you. In addition to that, we also have a great connection with students on social media. Moving a little bit away from Facebook, that used to be the bellwether, but now we're looking at different areas of talking to students on things like Instagram and Snapchat and things of that nature, where we can start to gather a little bit more information on kind of on a different platform. But the important thing is starting to really understand why is it and what are we doing that really drives student behavior. And again, looking at this, is we're to say, how important is local to you? Well, to these particular students, looking over 70% of the students are saying that, it is important to them that, we have a local program, and it does drive their consumption behaviors. When you start to look at, what it's going to do, and to the extent it's going to look at how it's going to look at what not only in college but after college. Our next slide talks a little bit about that as well. We're saying, okay, well, you have the opportunity to have some great food here at UMass, but what's that going to look like going into the future? And why is this important? Well, it's important because you take a look at the size of the population of student that is leaving. We just are transitioning from the millennial generation to the Gen Z generation. And what does that mean? Well, the millennial generation happens to be and will be the largest consumer base basically in history. They are about 78 million, and the baby boomer generation is about 72 to 74 million. So the millennials currently are the largest consumers in the country. And given what we see right now, based upon what their experience was, that the fact is that roughly a little over 70% of them say that local, healthy, sustainable foods are very important to them, we're going to start to see this behavior start to take place basically into mainstream in the next, over the next 30, 40, 50, 60 years, because these are going to be the consumers of tomorrow. So when we want to look at, the idea of how different industries are going to start to grow, and based upon the information that we get from students, driving into figuring out what, and again, there's been a lot of degrees of trying to figure out what exactly does local mean to you. Is it a mileage thing? Is it 250 miles? Is it a regional thing? Are there other factors into it? How do you measure it? By pounds, by weight, by whatever, by dollars? But one thing that's been tried and true overall is that the idea of connection to local really drives consumer behavior. And we're seeing that that's really important. And as you start to really get in touch and have more transparency of where your food comes from, students are really lagging into that. And it's also one of those things where we see the fact that even though there might be multiple definitions of it, the closer you can get to the person who's actually consuming the food, the better. When we want to see what are they consuming, our next slide talks a little bit about what the trends are in dining. And we want to take a look at things like that, basically looking at things like, what are they eating and how are they eating? So the consumption trend slide that I'm talking off right now, which is the following slide, basically comes in and talks a little bit about what, based upon our survey of our students, are students eating it? And, one of the things that's really interesting is you start to look at, okay, well, if you were to look at students and how they're consuming different particular menu items when they get to college and how much more they can consume, once they started, well, you might think that they're going to look at more indulgent foods and things of that nature, which is true, they will. But when you start to look at what really is at the core of what's driving their consumption behavior, the top consumption items are local and sustainable foods, moving then into more fruits and vegetables, and also into areas where even if you wanted to look at in that mid-range there between lean proteins and plant-based proteins, these not only have a benefit when it comes to health and wellness, but you also want to look at the fact of what the environmental impact upon that are. Taking a look at, as you move away from some of the red meat consumption and moving into more plant-based, the amount of water, the amount of fossil fuels, all these different things that go into these particular menu items. And as we start to look at, as the prior slide said, of what consumption behaviors are today and what they're going to go into the future, we're very optimistic about the fact that the consumer of tomorrow is actually going to be really looking at, why and how, what am I eating on a daily basis, and what that looks like into the next few years, as not only from what my diet's going to look like, but what the environmental impact of what my diet's going to look like. Just looking at what we purchased from New England alone on the next slide, when it comes to just our poultry. Actually, I guess I skipped over a slide there, but what we look at from what our overall no, actually I'll go back a slide, so that's okay. What I was going to talk a little bit about was what that impact is environmentally, and the amount of consumption behavior, when it looks like just overall from our students, that students are really cognizant about these things. But the other aspect of it, and what we talked about here on our food waste breakdown, is look, once you not only have to have a measure of what's coming in the door, you also have to have a measure of what's leaving the door. And that brings it into the balance. And you look at what the National Resource Defense Council talks a little bit about, the amount of kitchen waste for an average family, which is over 40%, which is ridiculous. And then the average restaurant consumption or waste consumption is a little over 15%. And then you kind of overshadow that with what we're looking at from either food insecurity and all sorts of other factors are coming into play here. We really need to find a way we can balance this out by reducing the amount of waste we have, as well as being able to repurpose food, lean foods, and different ways to this, which actually has a great impact upon your bottom line. So when you start to look at, is there a premium price or some local items? There is, and there can be. But at the same token, if you want to look at the net impact of the bottom line, you're able to measure these particular items, you're going to be able to find a way that's easier to balance your budget when it comes to, what we're able to serve and how we're able to serve it. My next slide talks a little bit about what and how people define themselves. And this is where it kind of becomes a little bit almost like what I consider the Omnivores dilemma in this particular case. And in most cases, students define themselves as being omnivores. And there hasn't been much change over time. We are seeing a bit of an increase in some of the flexitarians, and we're seeing some of those politarians and things of that nature, yes. At the same token, when you see what a student really eats on a daily basis, on the next slide here, is that they're actually looking at more plant-based proteins, more seafood-based diet. So students tend to define themselves as being omnivores simply because of the fact they want to be able to have the opportunity to try anything, I guess. But at the same token, when you look at consumption trends and things of how they're going to start to dine into the future, we're really starting to see this idea of a significant increase in what plant-based diet looks like, which again, from the environmental impact of it, as well as the health and benefit, as well as even the cost benefit. It costs less money to purchase plant-based items than it does, animal-based. And as you start to reap those benefits, you're able to bring those back into program in terms of your lower cost of goods sold, as well as being able to have much more of a flexible canvas of what you can offer students on a daily basis when it comes to menu items served. So, overall, we've been very committed and want to continue to use it. And I have to have my hats off to Michael because the find data is unbelievable. I really appreciate, and we utilize it routinely. So not to throw another plug for you all, but it's a great opportunity to start to look at how you can start to benchmark and look at different directions things are going. And from an operator point of view, that's really important to us. But also you able to use this and start to figure out how we start to do different menu engineering. And as you can see here, looking at a canvas of much more plant-based protein into the future. And that seems to be what students are starting to tell us is how they're going to dine, not only today, but once they leave our institution. I'm going to turn it back over to Tanya now to, I guess, do some wrap up.
All right. Well, thank you, Garrett, and thanks all of our speakers for helping us really take a deeper look at tracking our local food procurement. So I would like to take a little time to address some of the questions that have come through. So if all of our speakers could make sure that they're off mute, I'm going to throw a few questions your way. Jamie, you've already answered a couple by typing the answers in and clarifying a few questions that people had on your talk. So thanks for that.
No problem.
Okay, so first question. Jamie, if you were to set a goal of increasing local food at Colby-Sawyer College from the current 19% to say 25%, what would you focus on or how would you approach that goal?
Well, being that I'm coming from the corporate office, I oversee not only, we're doing the food for several different colleges, and it's really dependent on the budget of the institution. So, making a blanket statement of increasing it by 6%, I could say switch all of your proteins to local. Well, if they don't have the budget to be able to do that, that's obviously going to be a difficult goal to accomplish. So if there's no budgetary constraints, then I'd say switch your proteins over. So I'm not sure how to really answer that other than giving you somewhat of, the low-hanging fruit or something that is used on a regular basis is what you'd have to convert over. You could not do something with just converting maybe just coffee over to a local roaster would not be able to achieve a 6% increase. So there could be a variety of different ways of doing it, but everything is somewhat dictated or controlled by budget. So if there's no budget constraints, then I'd say switch your proteins over and you would have no problem hitting that 6%.
Thanks. This is a question for both Jamie and Garrett. Have you seen situations where efforts to purchase from New England has been in conflict with other values that you support, such as humanely raised, fair working conditions, or other sustainable issues? Garrett, why don't you go ahead and take that one first?
Sure. There can be. I think one of the bigger scenarios we're starting to look at is, in some cases, some of your smaller farmers have a bit of a challenge in terms of some of the certifications that might come into play. And for many generational farmers that are out there saying, look, I don't need to get a third-party stamp on what I'm doing. I know my land and I know my neighbors and I know what's coming out of the ground, or I know what I'm raising. So to be able to have that certification aspect of it, that can be troubling in the sense of being able to measure, as Michael and Jamie were talking about quantification about things in the past. In terms of I guess the advantage of being in New England, in terms of and again, this is giving another plug to the data from FIND, is that the size and acreage of local farms is vastly smaller than that when you have some of your agri farms that are out in the Midwest. So the majority of the farms are small and local. In which case the idea of CAFO and things like that are less prevalent. You're seeing more grass raised. You're seeing more free range. You're seeing more of a plant-based, and also when you're taking a look at some of the particular types of crops or even animals that are being raised, it's more along the lines of poultry and seafood, and you're starting to see some of the larger industry that we're looking at from that particular aspect of it. So to basically, not to any great extent we're seeing any conflict between the two, but the biggest and the largest area we're seeing is sort of certifications and being able to really tie that into, because of some of the financial constraints that some of these smaller farmers have.
Thanks, Garrett. Jamie, you're dealing with kind of a wider geographic net. Do you feel that you've had some conflicts there that you've had to manage?
So my conflicts are primarily on food safety. So, dealing with some of the smaller producers, we do run into, maybe a client may want one of us to purchase from a local farmer that doesn't meet our standards, doesn't have a traceability system built into their food safety plan. We really, that's usually where our challenge lies. But I would agree with Garrett that there are, many farmers and many producers out there that do not want to go through the third-party certification of getting, certified organic when their practices are already being met. So, with those, I do take of an understanding of what they're doing. And they still may fall under our verified products if we know their standards that they have in place. So if I have a local farmer that is producing, growing produce that is not USDA certified, but maybe they're naturally grown or certified naturally grown, or they're falling under maybe not even a certification for that matter, but I've been to their farm and I've seen their practices, we most likely would take a reservation to associate that product as being verified.
That's great. Thank you. And just a quick follow-up on that. are there sort of things that you've done as a company to work with some of these smaller suppliers I mean, you've talked a little bit about sort of some flexible approaches that you have. Have there been other things that you've done to sort of increase your understanding of their track record on some of these issues, or that you've done to help them sort of enter a certification or process or food safety process in order to meet your standards?
Yes, I coined myself a little bit as the consultant for our company of really working with a lot of these small producers on making sure that they, one, understand the importance of food safety, and then secondly, helping them establish traceability into their food system. So, I'm always worried more about where they're obtaining their products from to be able to produce a granola or be able to produce a kombucha, so I'm always asking, where are you obtaining and purchasing your items from? So I work very closely with numerous producers throughout 13 different states that we operate in. And, it's, so the answer is yes. I work very closely with them on our first. If someone came to us and they had a request to be able to start to sell to our locations and they don't meet the standards of our company, they're still going to end up getting a visit from me to at least see how far away they are from actually being able to supply product to us. And then ultimately I'd help them out if they were willing to listen and they were willing to follow what I'm asking them to do.
Thanks. We also had a question from Liana Shriver. She was asking if, Jamie, you could briefly talk about the financial data and some of what you've shared. She was asking if this is something that businesses offer up easily, if there are agreements around this to help guide that, and any challenges in getting that kind of data.
I'm not sure what that means.
I think that she was, my guess is that she was referencing some of the financial information that you shared, but I think that perhaps it's clarifying that this is sort of part of doing business, but maybe she's wondering if there's any sort of concern about confidentiality there.
With our operators or with
the vendors that you were listing?
There are vendors that supply to our location, so I can't imagine why there would be a conflict.
Yeah.
So
okay.
We're getting information directly from them. We ask for usage reports from every one of our suppliers that we do business with. And the ones that fit into this report, they provide us information. I mean, we are the entity that's paying them. So if it was coming from a student asking for this information, I would say that they probably would not send it. So as the Real Food Challenge model is in place, most likely the food service distributor or the food service operator or the director of dining services would be responsible for getting the reports for the students. So in the way that we go to market is that they don't need to do that. I'm already tracking that information for them. So a student would never have to pick up the phone and contact one of our vendors to pull a usage report. The usage reports we pretty much have on a quarterly basis. We get quarterly reports directly from our suppliers. So I'm not sure if there's necessarily a conflict.
Okay, thanks. Liana, if you have any other sort of clarifying points, you should feel free to make those in the Q&A box. Garrett, a quick question on which tier of local is the 30% local produce measurement? Was that in Massachusetts or New England or other?
We would be considering that more of New England as a whole, from 30%. We have a good percentage of our local produce, which I would probably say of the 30%, close to 20% of that, which would be in Massachusetts, and from that, a handful of probably about 30 farmers or so that we work with. And we work with about 100 local farmers on a routine basis. But then as you start to spread out the area to more to Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, which have obviously larger areas to grow, you start to have larger areas that we can actually source from. Generally speaking, we're utilizing not only product that we can use over the beginning and end of our school year, because that's obviously what our growing season starts to look like, but we're starting to utilize different practices so we can start to extend different things or utilize different things like hydroponics and things like that. One of our suppliers being Little Leaf, they do a great job with the ability for us to get some hydroponic lettuce throughout the school year. And as you even start to look at what the balance and cost of with different weather effects, certainly most currently even with tomatoes and what we're looking at from the effects of the hurricane, you're looking at a much more of a steady supply of product that you're going to be able to get locally, in which case you start to look at that from a budgetary point of view. It's not that you're paying a premium, it's actually in the sense that you're actually being able to have a consistent food supply, and the interruptions that you might be able, that could occur. And that's not only what most recently with Michael, when he looked at Superstorm Sandy and what happened with the whole New York area, there was a real concern about the fact that you weren't going to be able to have a steady supply of food because of just-in-time inventory. So when you start to look at local and how we start to have more of a secure food supply, this is becoming more of a wave for us to start to look at how we can not only look at from a budgetary, but also from a food security point of view.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we really only have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to, and lots of questions. So I'm going to ask one more question, share our final slides, and if there's any time, we'll try to answer a couple last questions at the end. So here's a question for both Jamie and Garrett. Do you feel that there's state or federal policy is affecting your local procurement practices? Are there any local preference laws that either of you have to deal with? Jamie, why don't you take that first?
I'm not familiar with any. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with any. I don't know.
Okay, Garrett?
So obviously, the Food Safety Modernization Act of 2017 was something that became and it's been one of those things that's kind of, out there. To that degree, though, we have such a strong relationship, and our procurement department does an amazing job of building these relationships with the local vendors. In Massachusetts, you do have the ability to have two different types of criteria when it comes to poultry and animal harvesting. You have the USDA, then you have the Massachusetts guidelines. As long as it's produced within Massachusetts and harvested within Massachusetts, we can start to look at those particular areas. But we also take it up a step further in developing our own HACCP type of plans for particular types of vendors, and really trying to build that relationship with them. So we're less prohibitive when we bring someone on board, but we're able to actually start to develop a partnership with them and being able to really see what and how, because at the end of the day, obviously food safety, and Jamie was hit it right on the head. We have to make sure that the food's coming in safe, but we also want to make sure that, we're being realistic about what we're asking and being able to full understanding what the products and what's coming in the door and how we're able to assure both food safety, but also access to local farmers at the same time.
All right. Caitlin, if you could move to the next slide, please. So I would just want to say thanks to Jamie and Garrett and Michael and for answering questions, and for those remaining questions, there's a lot of good ones still in there. I'll see what we can do about trying to get some of those answered for folks after the end of the webinar. That said, we wanted to share a few helpful resources. A lot of the tracking tools that we've been referring to in this presentation are listed here. Those include Excel spreadsheets, the Real Food Calculator from Real Food Challenge, ASHE STARS program, and then there are a number of other sort of more complex systems that are used for tracking all kinds of information, including Food Pro, Know Your Source, which is what Jamie has shared, Farm to Fork, Food Buy, and Vermont First. Those are all described in the tracking report, which you'll be receiving. We also have a number of tools available through the FINE website. So these are things that may directly deal with tracking, or sometimes elements of it are dealing with tracking. And those are all on our website, so you're able to reference those if you go to our the website. Their tracking report, which I've referenced, Campus Dining 101, which was described earlier by Michael, as well as the next Campus Dining survey results will be shared later next year. Then we have the metrics dashboards, our food service toolkit, other webinars from previous events are also located online, and you can see those, and also our summit coming up. Next slide, please. So in terms of what's coming next, as I mentioned, we do have the 2018 Campus Dining Survey that was just closed. So we're moving into the data analysis phase, and you can expect information from that to be presented around the time of our next summit, which is in the spring of next year. It takes a while to go through all of the data that we have. We've had over 100 respondents, which is great. We also have the tracking report, which we'll be releasing, and some other scopes of work, not reports necessarily, but we're going to be digging deeper into the possibility of creating some more commonalities around definitions of local, and if that's useful to folks in terms of their tracking. We're also going to be exploring the potential for regional numerical targets, and so if these are things that you're interested in, if these are things that you've thought about, we welcome you to participate in those discussions. Next, please. Finally, we hope that all of you will take a moment to click on this link. You can also find it in our chat bar. And please give us a quick evaluation of the webinar that we did today. It'll help us improve future webinars. Finally, if you want to continue the conversation, as I said, there's the summit coming up in April. There's also a number of working groups, so you're welcome to join a working group, either to join in on a particular aspect of a conversation, or if you want to become part of a project, or if you have ideas for things that we should be working on, we really welcome hearing that in our Farm and Sea to Campus network. We also have a listserv going for dining service operators, so if that's something you'd like, that's a great place to answer and ask questions or provide information to your peers. And finally, just feel free to send us any of your ideas. And we encourage you all to continue your efforts to keep on tracking the local food procurement that you're doing, and sharing information about what you're doing as well. If you are able to, we'd love to have you for our next webinar, which is coming up in November. Date still to be determined, but we'll get that out as soon as we can. We'll be starting a new series called Product Spotlight, where we'll be digging in on specific products, really looking at what it takes to increase local food procurement on these. And our first one is on seafood in New England. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And like I said, we'll do our best to answer any of those remaining questions that came up. Thank you all for a great suite of questions. Thank you to our presenters for sharing information about your work. We really appreciate it. That kind of transparency and sharing your lessons with us are all really helpful as we continue this effort. Thank you so much.